Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson spotted the Messerschmitt Bf 109 at 20,000 feet over Southampton on the 16th of August, 1940, a day when the sky looked deceptively peaceful, pale blue and streaked with thin cirrus clouds that hid none of the tension boiling beneath. His Hawker Hurricane Mk.I shuddered slightly as he coaxed every ounce of power from its Merlin engine, the propeller blurring into a silver disk while the machine strained at an altitude where the air was thin and the margin between life and death thinner still. He knew the routine far too well. A German fighter would break off from its escort, the Hurricane would attempt to chase, and within 30 seconds the inevitable truth would reveal itself. The Bf 109, with its superior speed, would simply pull away and vanish into the distance as though mocking the very idea of pursuit. Nicholson had lived that moment dozens of times already, and even as he tightened his grip on the control column, he felt the familiar frustration rising. The enemy pilot glanced back, saw him closing, and with what felt like effortless indifference opened his throttle. The German fighter surged ahead. 50 yards, then 100, then 200. Nicholson's airspeed indicator trembled at 290 miles per hour, the limit of what his aging Hurricane could offer at that altitude. The Messerschmitt was doing well over 320. The gap widened like a wound reopening, slowly, painfully, inevitably. Another German fighter escaped. Another chance lost. And Nicholson knew with a sick certainty that this was not an isolated failure, but the reality faced by every Hurricane squadron over southern England during that suffocating summer of 1940. Day after day, pilots strapped themselves into cockpits knowing they were flying machines incapable of catching an enemy that held every speed advantage that mattered. The mathematics of the situation were unforgiving. The Bf 109 Emil could reach 342 miles per hour in level flight at 15,000 feet. The Hurricane Mk.I, even with a healthy engine, rarely touched 316 at the same altitude. That 26-mile-per-hour gap was not merely a technical statistic. It was a tactical no-os around Fighter Command's neck. It meant German pilots could initiate combat when it suited them, disengage whenever danger loomed, and survive encounters that British pilots desperately wanted to turn into kills. Squadron commanders were nearly frantic, filing report after report describing engagements that slipped through their fingers like smoke. Pursued enemy aircraft for 2 minutes before he drew out of range. Closed to 400 yards but unable to reduce distance further. Enemy aircraft dived away, unable to follow effectively. These were not complaints of cowardice or incompetence. The Hurricane pilots were brave, well-trained, and deadly when they could bring their guns to bear. But their aircraft simply could not run down a fleeing Bf 109. The Spitfire was better, blessed with a top speed of 362 miles per hour at 19,000 feet, but in August 1940 Fighter Command had fewer than 300 serviceable Spitfires, while Hurricanes numbered nearly 600. The workhorse of the Battle of Britain, the aircraft that shot down more German planes than all other defenses combined, was being asked to perform a task it physically could not accomplish. The result was mounting casualties, not always from being shot down directly, but from being pinned into defensive positions, forced to react rather than dictate the fight. German pilots executed slashing diving attacks, fired quick bursts, and then simply stepped on the throttle and exited the engagement before the Hurricanes could retaliate. The British pilots were left with a humiliating feeling of helplessness, not because they lacked skill, but because their machines lacked speed. By mid-August, this frustration had seeped into morale. Some pilots began to question whether victory was possible when their primary fighter could not even chase down the opposition. Ground crews whispered their own frustrations. Analysts at Farnborough knew the problem. The Air Ministry knew the problem. Everyone knew the problem. The Hurricane was too slow. And there appeared to be no solution that could be implemented quickly. Britain did not have the luxury of waiting 6 months for new engines, new airframes, or new designs to emerge from the factories. Yet, as is often the case in war, innovation did not come from the upper levels of command or the minds of senior engineers. Instead, it came from overworked, underpaid flight sergeants working in cold dispersal huts with spanners, torches, and a willingness to break rules when rules endangered lives. The source of the problem stared them in the face every day. The massive 11-foot de Havilland or Rotol constant-speed propeller bolted to the nose of each Hurricane. A miracle of engineering for its time, the constant-speed unit allowed the blades to change pitch during flight, shifting between fine pitch for takeoff and coarse pitch for cruising. But the mechanism included hard physical stops, metal pins that prevented the blades from rotating beyond the limits set during peacetime testing. Those stops capped how far the blades could flatten in coarse pitch, and thus capped how much drag could be reduced at high speed. The Hurricane's propeller stops had been set conservatively in 1938, long before anyone imagined the desperate aerial battles unfolding over southeast England. The goal then was engine longevity and mechanical safety, not absolute speed. But in 1940 the equation had reversed. A handful of flight sergeants, men like Harold "Bunny" Roos of No. 17 Squadron and Bill Mintz of No. 32 Squadron, understood the flaw immediately. They had run the numbers on cigarette packets. They had listened to pilots complain night after night. And they knew that if they could increase the maximum course pitch by even 3 or 4 degrees, the propeller would produce less drag at high speed, allowing the aircraft to achieve an extra 10, perhaps 15 miles per hour. That was enough to erase the speed advantage of the Bf 109. Enough to save lives. Enough to change the course of engagements. But such a modification was absolutely forbidden. Air Publication 129, The Gospel of RAF Maintenance, made it clear that no engineer or mechanic could alter an aircraft system without Air Ministry approval. To do so risked court-martial, reduction in rank, imprisonment, and perhaps worst of all, being responsible for killing a pilot if the system failed in flight. And yet every mechanic who looked at the propeller hub knew the modification could be done in under an hour with basic tools. The breaking point came on the night of the 22nd of August at Martlesham Heath. Flight Sergeant James Fitter watched 2 more young pilots return from combat hollow-eyed with frustration. One of them, barely 20, had nearly cornered a Bf 109 only to see it pull away effortlessly. His hands were shaking with rage, not fear. Fitter realized in that moment that the regulations were condemning pilots to die unnecessarily. So he walked out to Hurricane L-1842 with a toolbox and a torch, intending to commit an act that could end his career and his freedom but might save the lives of those boys. The modification he performed was straightforward to him. He had been maintaining constant speed propellers for years. After removing the spinner, he accessed the small collar inside the hub that served as the physical course pitch stop. He removed the collar, carried it to the workshop, and filed down the metal stop pin by 3 millimeters. That tiny change allowed the blades to rotate roughly 3 degrees flatter in course pitch, enough to significantly reduce drag. He reassembled everything with painstaking care, ensuring no filings contaminated the hydraulic system. It took 47 minutes. The dawn test flight was flown by Flying Officer Peter Dawn, who listened in silence as Fitter explained the illegal modification. Dawn could have reported him on the spot. Instead, he climbed into the cockpit, took off, and leveled out at 15,000 feet. He opened the throttle. The airspeed indicator passed 300 miles per hour, then 310, 315, 320, and finally settled at 328, 12 miles an hour faster than the aircraft had ever flown before. Dawn landed, walked to Fitter, and quietly said, "Do the rest of them." And so, under the cover of darkness, Fitter and 2 other sergeants modified 6 Hurricanes. By sunrise on the 23rd, No. 17 Squadron possessed 7 Hurricanes capable of speeds the Air Ministry believed impossible. The true test came 2 days later when Flight Lieutenant Gordon Sinclair intercepted a Bf-109 after it strafed a convoy near Harwich. The German opened his throttle to escape, confident the Hurricane would fall behind. But Sinclair stayed with him. From 600 yards he closed to 400, then 300, then 200. At 150 yards he opened fire. The enemy crashed into the sea trailing smoke. Sinclair returned to base astonished and demanded to speak to Fitter. "Whatever you did," he said, "it works." From that moment the modification spread like a whispered secret, never officially acknowledged, never written down, but quietly shared among those who trusted one another. Across Fighter Command, squadrons began altering their Hurricanes at night, always in secret, always with the knowledge that discovery meant court-martial. Inspectors could arrive at any moment, so the ground crews developed warning systems. If an inspection was expected, the modified collars were swapped back to factory settings, then reinstalled after the inspectors left. Pilots, too, learned to censor their combat reports. Instead of writing, "achieved 325 miles per hour in pursuit," they wrote, "maintained contact with enemy aircraft." Yet the effect in combat was unmistakable. Squadrons with modified Hurricanes began achieving sustained pursuits previously impossible. German pilots, accustomed to simply opening up and running, found Hurricanes still behind them, closing the gap. Claims increased. Luftwaffe reports began noting worrying improvements in British fighter performance. A situation report from Jagdgeschwader 51 complained that British aircraft were demonstrating improved speed characteristics. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots became more cautious. British pilots felt hope instead of helplessness. A tiny 3mm filing job had shifted the emotional balance of air combat. By September the modifications were widespread, though still secret. Some squadrons noticed stark differences when receiving replacement Hurricanes from maintenance units. Aircraft fresh from the factory were slower than their modified fleetmates until ground crews quietly corrected them. Everything might have remained hidden were it not for Wing Commander Thomas Prickman of the Air Ministry's Directorate of Technical Development, who arrived unannounced at Tangmere on the 12th of October. A former de Havilland engineer, Prickman personally measured the blade angles on several Hurricanes. All were 3 degrees outside specification. The discovery triggered an inquiry that rippled across Fighter Command. 14 squadrons were inspected. 11 had modified propellers. The scale of unauthorized tinkering was staggering. Hundreds of aircraft had been altered without approval. But when senior commanders examined the combat data, something startling emerged. Squadrons with modified Hurricanes had a 37% higher success rate in Bf-109 engagements requiring pursuit, without experiencing a single mechanical failure attributable to the modifications. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, fighting to hold Britain's air defense together by his fingernails, recognized the truth. The flight sergeants had been right. The regulations had been wrong. On the 23rd of October 1940, the Air Ministry issued Order A.743, officially authorizing the pitch-stop modification on all Hurricanes. The specifications were, suspiciously, nearly identical to the measurements the sergeants had devised. Commendations quietly replaced court-martial threats. Years later, in 1946, Royal Aircraft Establishment engineer Dennis Braftoft discovered why the modification had worked so flawlessly. De Havilland's original 1938 stress calculations had mistakenly used sea-level air density figures for altitude performance, resulting in overly conservative pitch limits. The propellers had always been capable of handling the higher course pitch angle. The flight sergeants, guided by intuition and operational necessity rather than equations, had accidentally corrected a mathematical error. The significance of this episode is easy to overlook when studying grand strategy, radar networks, and shifting tides of aerial warfare. Yet in the cockpit, where a pilot fought for seconds of advantage, 12 additional miles per hour could be the difference between life and death. It changed the psychology of combat. It gave Hurricane pilots the ability to pursue rather than merely defend. It forced Luftwaffe pilots to reconsider their once casual escapes. More than that, it demonstrated that great victories often hinge not on sweeping strategy but on humble acts of practical genius carried out in the shadows by people whose names never appear in textbooks. The Battle of Britain was not won solely by radar, nor by Churchill's rhetoric, nor by the heroism of pilots alone. It was won by a combination of skill, courage, leadership, and the willingness of a few ground crewmen to defy the rulebook on a dark August night because they knew they could make their pilots just a little faster, just a little safer, just a little more deadly. That forbidden modification, illegal, risky, quiet, became standard practice by November. Hurricanes continued fighting into 1941 and beyond, eventually replaced by faster machines. The modification faded into technical obscurity, a mere line in a maintenance manual. But for a few critical weeks in 1940, it represented something profound. The difference between losing and surviving, between despair and hope, between watching an enemy pull away untouched and watching him fall burning into the sea. It embodied the truth that wars are won not only by generals and planners, but by the hands of ordinary men turning spanners in the dark.